So you're familiar with The Great Gatsby, right?
Yeah, the book by Scott Fitzgerald. I actually just finished reading it for the first time.
Oh, interesting. I was hoping to focus mostly on the aspects of how women were represented in this book, specifically how their roles changed throughout the 1920s and how Fitzgerald chose to represent it in this book.
Sure.
So, what do you know about that?
So, a big cultural symbol of the 1920s was flappers, just young women often with a short bob hairstyle, usually wearing a lot of makeup, and were often pictured dancing jazz bands. But one of the biggest things happened to women in the 1920s happened right at the beginning of the decade when they were given the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. Some states had given them that right beforehand, but it was made countrywide throughout the amendment.
That mainly applied to white women, though, since many black women were denied the right to vote in the South due to a number of practices put in place until the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, barring discriminatory voting practices based on race. But it's still known as one of the greatest accomplishments of the decade for women.
Yeah.
F. Scott Fitzgerald was able to represent these changing roles in others as well through two main characters in this story, Daisy Buchanan and Jordan Baker, one being a more tragic storyline than the other. Starting off with Daisy Buchanan, Fitzgerald uses her as a way to represent the older and traditional role of women from just a few years prior. Daisy is shown as this lady who is reliant on her husband and those around her to make decisions and speak for her, as she's never been fully taught or seemingly cared to learn about how to do that herself. An example of this is actually in chapter 7, when Tom and Gatsby get into an argument over who Daisy actually loves. She was being pressured by Gatsby to tell Tom she had never loved him, which we all know is a lie. But after a long back and forth, Daisy says, quote, "Please, Tom, I can't stand this anymore," which is her relying on what she sees as a more comfortable route.
Sure, she could become more independent, but Daisy probably sees her current relationship with Tom as a more comfortable and easy route. Daisy's basically representing how many men wanted women to act and how many women thought they should act before the 1920s, and she's very reliant on Tom and seemingly isn't willing to make her own decisions. Again, that isn't her fault since she's just being conditioned this way from the people around her and through society at the time. Remember, it was the 1920s, and even though we made a significant amount of progress in terms of sexism, it was still a very male-focused world back in the 1920s.
Exactly, but this novel isn't all about how women were expected to act a few decades prior. Fitzgerald also portrays the growth in women's rights and freedoms through the character of Jordan Baker. She's a different story to Daisy, as she is very much an independent woman who has stuck up for herself and what she believes in no matter what you say. She's wealthy and had become a famous golfer, showing her independence and using her abilities to a greater length than many women had been able to before. She spends her time doing stuff that would be considered inappropriate or unexpected for women to do back then, like smoking cigarettes, driving, and openly drinking alcohol, striking a difference between her and Daisy, as Daisy is more traditional in her actions.
Yeah, she's very much so Fitzgerald's way of representing the progress made in the 1920s for women's rights and how they used them. Throughout the early 1900s and especially the 1920s, women were no longer expected to stick to sexist roles as they started working and doing activities that many formerly would only expect men to do, which we all know is a good thing, and that is represented in this novel through Jordan. It's shown in this book many times, one being in chapter 7 when Nick says, quote, "There was Jordan beside me who, unlike Daisy, was too wise to ever carry well-forgotten dreams from age to age," giving us a comparison we were looking for. He blatantly told us how, compared to Daisy, Jordan is a much more practical person and isn't the type of person to hold on to past relationships, information, and people that aren't relevant for long periods of time.
Yeah, and another example of this is in chapter
9
when Jordan says, quote, "You said a bad driver was only safe until she met another bad driver. Well, I met another bad driver, didn't I? I mean, it was careless of me to make such a wrong guess. I thought you were rather an honest, straightforward person." Which is a bit rude and harsh, but it shows that she's focused on being with someone she feels suits her personality well, and if Nick is a, quote, bad driver like she is, she won't seem fit to be with her. These show that F. Scott Fitzgerald used Daisy and Jordan to display two different time periods in this novel. Daisy representing an older mindset where women relied more on their husbands and the men around them, while Jordan represents a new and independent mindset where that wasn't really a concern anymore and more women were doing what they wanted instead of what society thought they should.
Yeah, he did a good job of this, as without explicitly saying that this is what's going on, Through Jordan and Daisy's expression, we were able to pick up on how he was choosing to display the changing role of women in the 1920s. The message of this book and the detailed story could have made some miss these details entirely, but looking far enough into it, it's pretty easy to see that Fitzgerald was using this novel to also portray how women used to act and how they were acting when this novel was being written.
Women gained a lot of rights in the 1920s, like the right to vote and being able to work more and get paid for their labor instead of staying at home, and Fitzgerald represented that really well in this book through the conflicts and roles Daisy and Jordan took on throughout the novel. And that concludes this conversation. Thanks, Clone of Me, for joining.
No problem. If you'll excuse me, I have to get back to reading different books because I love reading.
Okay. Well, that was informative.